I'm Elena, and up until last Thanksgiving, I was the walking credit card for my family. That night, after my dad disowned me at the dinner table in front of our entire family, I went home and systematically dismantled every financial tie, every bill, and every service I had been funding for over a decade. I never expected the complete chaos that would unfold by morning, a chaos that revealed a truth more painful than any lie. The quiet moment I hit cancel was a goodbye, not just to them, but to a version of myself I had to leave behind. If you have ever felt like you were just a resource to the people you love, or if you've had to cut off a toxic family member, this story is for you. Before I dive into my story, I'd really appreciate it if you could let me know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you'd consider subscribing to my channel. It would mean the world to me and help me keep sharing more stories like this. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Elena. I went home and systematically dismantled every financial tie, every bill, and every service I had been funding for over a decade. It was a goodbye not just to them, but to a version of myself I had to leave behind. My story began in a quiet suburban home in Pittsburgh, a place where the air was always thick with unspoken expectations and the sweet scent of my mother's baking, a facade for a bitter reality. From the moment I was old enough to understand, I knew my place. I was the diligent, reliable daughter who earned straight A's and never asked for anything. My younger brother, Mark, was the opposite. He was the golden child, the one who effortlessly commanded the room with a crooked smile and a half-baked plan for a new business venture. His life was a series of grand gestures and spectacular failures, each one met with a parental reassurance that he was learning life lessons and a fresh influx of my parents' money, which I later discovered was my money. I remember my 8th birthday party. Mark, then 3, threw a tantrum because he wanted to be the one to open my presents. My parents, instead of reprimanding him, gave him his own present, a new toy car to placate him. They then told me to be a good big sister and share. It was a pattern that repeated itself throughout our childhood. When Mark decided to start his own landscaping business in high school, it was my savings from my after-school job that bought his new lawnmower and tools. When he invested in a cryptocurrency that turned out to be a scam, it was my college fund that my parents used to bail him out. I never complained. I just worked harder, taking on more freelance design jobs in college, telling myself that it was a small price to pay for family harmony. My life became a constant, draining cycle of giving and hoping, a silent prayer that one day, my sacrifice would be seen and appreciated. My success was a tool to be used, not an accomplishment to be celebrated. After college, I moved to Chicago and built a successful career as an independent graphic designer. I found an old, sun-soaked apartment with hardwood floors and big windows, a space that was entirely my own. I finally had a life separate from my family, but the emotional and financial ties remained. I was the one they called when the furnace broke, the one they turned to when Mark needed a down payment for yet another failed business venture. I became their safety net, a human ATM with no interest rate and unlimited withdrawals. I never said a word about it. It was just what was expected of me. They would mention my success to their friends, but never to me. It was a cold, distant pride, a way of showing off their beautiful daughter without ever truly acknowledging my worth. Every time they would casually drop a line like, "Oh, Elena is doing so well. She's a big-time designer." I knew it was just their way of justifying their constant financial requests. They didn't see me as Elena the person. They saw me as Elena the provider. I was a secret strength, a source of stability they never acknowledged. That Thanksgiving, I arrived with a meticulously prepared brisket, a family favorite they always said Mark made better, and a subtle but powerful hope that this time, it would be different. But the moment I stepped inside, the usual roles reestablished themselves. My brother, with his usual charm, greeted me with a joking request for money to fix the dishwasher. It wasn't a request, it was a statement, a casual expectation that I would, as always, be there to foot the bill. I forced a smile and went to help my mother in the kitchen, a space that was both a haven and a battleground. She was an expert at quiet emotional manipulation, a master of passive-aggressive commentary that could cut deeper than any angry outburst, as she arranged the beautiful pumpkin pies, a masterpiece of domesticity. She regaled me with a story about Mark helping a neighbor fix a leaky faucet, her voice full of pride. It was a simple, innocent story, but in our family, every story had a subtext. She then looked at me, her eyes holding a faint disappointment, and said, "You see? My son knows how to use his hands to help others, not just his credit card." The words were a quiet, devastating blow. It was the moment I realized that my years of financial support were not seen as acts of love, but as something distant and impersonal, a transaction rather than a connection. She wasn't praising Mark for his helpfulness. She was highlighting my perceived coldness, a subtle manipulation that had become their default language. I remember the weight of the brisket platter in my hands, a symbolic burden I had carried for years. As I placed it on the table, I felt a tremor of anger I had long suppressed. It was the first time I truly questioned the script I had been given to live. It was the first time I saw them not as my family, but as a group of people who had been taking from me my entire life. We gathered around the dinner table, a tableau of a perfect family, and for a moment, I considered letting it go, letting the night play out as it always did, but the words of my mother, and the quiet truth in my cousin Chloe's question, "Why aren't you in any of the family photos?" echoed in my mind. The brisket, the pie, the beautifully set table. It all felt like a performance. I wanted them to see the woman behind the wallet. I wanted them to see the years of sacrifice, the long nights, the missed opportunities. I took a deep breath, my hands shaking slightly beneath the tablecloth, and began to speak, my voice calm, almost detached. I started with the most recent expenses the new truck Mark drove, the upgraded heating system for the house, even the oven that was currently baking the turkey, all paid for by me. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a recitation of facts. And in that silence, I watched their faces fall, the easy smiles replaced by a cold, hard resentment. My father's face hardened. He put his carving knife down with a loud clang, the sound echoing in the stillness, and looked at me with a look of utter disgust. He told me I was turning Thanksgiving into a bidding war and that family is not a ledger. He then uttered the words that would change everything. "If you view this family as an investment, you'd better pull out now, because from this day on, there is no place for a child like you in this family." In that moment, Chloe, my younger cousin who had been quietly watching all evening, stood up and in a clear, unwavering voice said, "But she's not lying. Uncle Richard, she has done all these things. Who else would have paid for that?" Her innocent words broke the spell, exposing the hypocrisy and the unspoken truth we had all been living. The silence that followed was even more profound, a tangible absence of sound that felt like a crack in the foundation of everything we thought we were. I left the house without a word, the tears streaming down my face not from sadness, but from a strange, exhilarating sense of freedom. My heart was broken, but it was also, finally, truly my own. I got in my car and drove, not home, but to a quiet parking lot overlooking the city, where I sat and just breathed for the first time in my life. I wasn't trying to be what they wanted me to be. I was just Elena. I thought about the years of giving, the endless cycle of being the good daughter, and I realized that my father's act of disowning me was the greatest gift he could have given. He freed me from a cage I had spent my life trying to build higher. It was a liberation, a sudden, blinding realization that I no longer had to earn a love that was never truly there. I went home, and with a quiet, terrifying calm, I sat at my laptop. I started with the smallest things, the streaming subscriptions, the phone bills, the cloud storage accounts. I moved on to the bigger ones, the car insurance for my brother's truck, the payments for their new roof, with each click of the mouse, with each account I closed and password I changed. I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. It wasn't about revenge, it was about reclamation. It was about taking back control of my own life, my own money, and my own narrative. The process was methodical, almost meditative. I wasn't angry anymore. I was simply doing what needed to be done. It was the quietest revolution I had ever been a part of. The cursor blinked on the screen as I meticulously went through the list in my head: Netflix, Hulu, the family cell phone plan under my name, the utilities for their house, the mortgage payment I had been contributing to for years. All of it. With each click of the cancel button, a small part of me that had been suffocating for so long finally breathed. I was severing not just financial ties, but emotional ones. It was a final, definitive action that left no room for doubt or regret. The next morning, I woke up to a flurry of frantic messages and missed calls. My phone was a buzzing, vibrating testament to the chaos I had unleashed. I read the first one, from my mother, and a faint smile touched my lips. "Elena, we need you to come back. The oven stopped working, the turkey is ruined." Her message, devoid of any apology or remorse, was the final, devastating piece of evidence that they only valued me for what I could provide, not for who I was. The family I was born into was gone, and I had found the strength to walk away. The only family that mattered now was the one I would choose, the one that saw my worth and loved me without conditions. I was finally, truly free. I didn't respond. I didn't feel the need to. There was nothing left to say. I made a cup of coffee, the aroma filling my quiet apartment, and I just sat there, listening to the silence, a silence that for the first time in my life felt like a peaceful melody instead of a deafening absence. The phone buzzed again, but I didn't even glance at it. The journey of self-discovery and healing had just begun, and I was finally ready to embark on it, one quiet, independent step at a time. The first person to call was Mark. His voice was frantic, a sound I had never heard before. He had always been so confident, so sure of his place in the world. Now, he sounded like a lost child. "Elena, what's going on? Mom's freaking out. The cable's off and the internet just went out. And the car insurance. I just got an email that the policy was canceled." I listened to his panicked rambling, a faint sense of satisfaction washing over me. "I'm not sure what to tell you, Mark," I said, my voice calm and even. "I'm not part of the family anymore. You'll have to figure it out yourself." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. He had never had to deal with a problem on his own before. He had always had me, and now he had nothing. Over the next few days, the calls and texts intensified. My parents, who had been so quick to disown me, were now begging me to come back, to talk things through. But their messages weren't about love or reconciliation. They were about the chaos I had caused. "The water heater is leaking," my mom texted. The power company sent a shut-off notice. Their world was falling apart, and they couldn't understand why. They couldn't grasp the simple fact that I was no longer their source of stability. It was like they were a couple of toddlers whose favorite toy had been taken away. They didn't understand the reason. They just wanted it back. I found myself checking my phone, not out of a desire to reconnect, but out of a morbid curiosity to see what new crisis had erupted in their lives. It was a dark, twisted kind of satisfaction, a validation that my years of giving had not gone unnoticed, even if they had gone unappreciated. A week later, I received a call from Chloe. Her voice was soft, hesitant. I just wanted to say, "What you did was amazing. It was a long time coming." Her words were a balm to my soul, a confirmation that I wasn't crazy, that someone else had seen the truth. She told me that after I left. The dinner had quickly disintegrated. My parents had tried to pretend that nothing had happened, but the tension was too thick to ignore. My father had tried to call me, but I had already blocked his number. He had then turned on Mark, blaming him for the financial problems. And Mark, for the first time in his life, had stood up to him. "You always said you'd take care of us," he had said, "but it was always Elena who did it." She's the one who kept this family afloat, not you. Chloe's story gave me a sense of peace I hadn't felt since that night. I had been worried that my actions would cause a permanent rift, but I now saw that the rift had always been there. I had simply been the one who was holding the two sides together by letting go. I had allowed them to finally see the truth, to face the consequences of their own actions. My parents' world had been built on a foundation of my money and my generosity, and without me, it was crumbling. Mark was finally being forced to take responsibility for his own life, and my parents were finally being forced to confront the reality that they had been taking from their daughter for years without giving anything in return. I spent the next few months rediscovering myself. I went to a pottery class, something I had always wanted to do but had never had the time for. I took a trip to the mountains, a place where I could be alone with my thoughts and just breathe. I reconnected with old friends, people who had always seen me as Elena, not as a source of money or emotional support. I started to build a new family, a family of choice, a family that loved me for who I was, not for what I could provide. The final chapter of my story, for now, came 2 months after Thanksgiving. I received a letter from my mother. It wasn't an apology, not a true one anyway. It was a plea, a last-ditch effort to get me to come back. "We miss you, Elena," she wrote. "The house feels so empty without you." I held the letter in my hands, a tangible piece of their desperation, and I felt a pang of something I hadn't expected, a deep, profound sadness. It wasn't just sadness for the family I had lost, but for the one that never truly existed, a part of me, the little girl who just wanted her parents' approval, ached to answer their call, to go back, to fix everything, to make the pain go away. I imagined myself driving back to Pittsburgh, walking through the front door, and seeing their faces light up. I imagined the relief in their eyes, the unspoken gratitude for my return. But then I saw the words again. "The house feels so empty without you. Not we miss you, but the house feels empty." It was a subtle but crucial distinction. They missed my presence, yes, but only because my absence had created a void they couldn't fill. They were missing the things I provided, the stability, the financial security, the unwavering support. They weren't missing Elena, their daughter. They were missing the ATM. The illusion of a loving family, once so fragile, was now completely shattered. The letter wasn't a bridge to reconciliation. It was a testament to their continued inability to see me as a person. I sat with that letter for hours, the conflict raging inside me. Was I strong enough to let go? Was I ready to permanently close the door on my past? On the family I had spent my entire life trying to save? My heart ached, a physical pain in my chest that made it hard to breathe, the temptation to give in, to go back to the familiar, even if it was toxic, was overwhelming. But then I looked around my apartment, at the pottery I had made, at the pictures of my new friends, at the life I had built for myself, a life that was truly mine, free from the weight of their expectations. It was a life I had fought for, a life I had earned. I finally put the letter down, a tear rolling down my cheek. It was a tear of grief, a tear for the family that could have been, for the love that was never given. But it was also a tear of triumph, a final act of letting go. I was no longer a victim. I was no longer a resource. I was a survivor. The letter was a relic, a piece of a past I was no longer bound to. I got up, walked to my kitchen, and made a fresh cup of coffee. The phone buzzed again, but I didn't even glance at it. The journey of self-discovery and healing had just begun, and I was finally ready to embark on it. One quiet, independent step at a time. The family that mattered now was the one I would choose, the one that saw my worth and loved me without conditions. I was finally, truly free.